She didn't resist when they cuffed her at the range. No badge, no explanation, just a quiet woman hitting impossible targets who refused to identify herself. The small-town courthouse prepared for a routine hearing until the heavy doors opened. A Navy admiral in full-dress uniform walked silently down the center aisle. Veterans stood. The judge went pale reading the sealed documents. And suddenly, everything changed. This isn't just about a name. It's about a legacy hidden in plain sight. Where in the world are you watching from today? If this story resonates, consider subscribing for more untold accounts of extraordinary service. Fog covered the treetops above Calder's Bluff as the sun pushed through slowly, casting a dull gray across the gravel lot and rifle lanes. It was just past 6 when Elijah McGraw stepped into the office booth with a thermos in one hand and muscle memory in the other. 12 years running this range had given him more than routine. It had given him a way to measure people the second they stepped onto the line. Before that, he'd spent 3 decades in Uniform 20 in the Army Rangers, the rest doing work most people didn't ask about. He'd seen shooters of all kinds, from kids trying out their first rifle to federal guys who couldn't talk about where they'd been. That morning, when the woman stepped out of a dusty Ford pickup and headed straight for lane 12, something in him noticed. She was in her 30s, maybe early 40s, dressed in faded jeans and a plain gray jacket. Her ball cap was pulled low, face half-shadowed. No decals, no insignia, no gear that stood out. Over one shoulder was a soft-sided rifle case. She moved with the kind of calm that didn't belong to someone new to firearms. She didn't pause at the main table or check the lane signs. She just walked straight to the farthest point on the property, lane 12, without hesitation. Lane 12 had wind from 2 directions and uneven morning light. Most shooters avoided it. But she laid out her rifle in silence and began setting up with practiced efficiency. McGraw watched from the booth. No spotting scope. No wind meter. No rangefinder. Iron sights only. She chambered around and positioned herself low, grounded, stable. The first shot rang out, and McGraw brought the binoculars up. The 100-yard target showed a dead-center impact. She cycled the bolt and fired again. Second target, 200 yards, same result. Then she shifted and took the 300-yard target. Still center, no adjustment to the rifle, no change in rhythm. Her breathing was measured and repeatable: inhale 4 counts, pause, exhale slow, fire. McGraw had seen that kind of control in combat shooters, and only in those who'd fired under pressure, not just paper. A young man on lane 6 noticed too, and asked if she was using a scope. McGraw replied without taking his eyes off the binoculars. She doesn't need one. She reads the wind like some folks read the Bible. The man blinked and stepped back. By the time she reached the 500-yard target, 3 shooters had stopped what they were doing. She didn't acknowledge them. She wasn't performing. Her focus never left the target line. She reloaded without rush, every motion smooth. There was no uncertainty, no need to pause and check. It wasn't practice, it was assessment. McGraw pulled up the database again. No check-in record, no ID, no reservation. He looked at the case tags through the camera zoom. Nothing. Just a numberless black case, and a notebook beside it with handwritten notes and what looked like hand-drawn coordinates. No logos, no unit markings. He'd seen Delta guys pass through, DevGru, MARSOC. Most left a Tracia call sign, a glance, a habit. This one left nothing. But the way she handled the rifle, the way she worked the environment, it said more than paperwork ever could. She'd done something, somewhere, that didn't go in official reports. And the way she chose lane 12, of all places, told him this wasn't a coincidence. So McGraw didn't approach. He didn't call for anyone. He just watched. Quietly. Respectfully. Because every instinct told him whatever brought her here today wasn't about practice. And lane 12 wasn't supposed to be this quiet. Not today. It was a regular Thursday crowd, 3 hunters checking their scopes before the season, a retired cop with his grandkid on lane 2, and a group of out-of-towners with high-end gear and loud opinions. They noticed her within minutes. The way she moved, the silence around her, the precision of each shot. One of them, a man in a camo vest with too many patches, watched her through binoculars, then stepped into the office. "She military?" he asked McGraw. McGraw didn't answer. "She's not wearing a badge," the man added. "No range ID either. You check her in?" McGraw stared at the man for a long second. Then, quietly, he reached for the logbook. Blank. The call to the sheriff's office went out 20 minutes later. The official report would say it came from a concerned citizen. The unofficial truth was that the woman at lane 12 made the others nervous not because she was aggressive, but because she wasn't. She didn't talk, didn't look at anyone. She just kept shooting, clean and exact, like she wasn't there to practice but to remember. Deputy Emmett Rourke arrived 10 minutes after the call, alone, driving the older unit cruiser he preferred over the newer models. He walked the gravel line slowly, one hand resting near his belt, the other casually tipping his hat as he passed the other lanes. When he reached lane 12, he stood back a few feet and spoke evenly. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification and your range permit." She didn't flinch. Her left hand stayed open at her side. The right rested on the stock of her rifle, barrel pointed downrange. She turned her head slowly and looked at him, her expression unreadable. "ID and permit, please," Rourke said again. She blinked once. Her voice was low, calm. "I don't have those with me." Rourke glanced at the case on the bench beside her. He saw no name tags, no labels. He looked back at her hands. No sudden movement, no tension. Just complete stillness. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," he said. She nodded once. That was it. No resistance, no words, no defense. She laid the rifle down gently, stepped away from the bench, and held out her hands. Rourke hesitated before cuffing her. He wasn't sure why. Something about her made it feel wrong. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry. She was prepared. At the cruiser, he checked her pockets. No phone, no wallet. Nothing except a plain white magnetic keycard with no logo or text and a small black notebook filled with what looked like coordinates and unit-style shorthand. Rourke flipped through it briefly, didn't understand a word, and closed it. At the station, the booking officer asked her name. She said nothing. "Ma'am, you understand refusing to identify yourself is a criminal offense." She looked at him, not defiant, not afraid, just steady, silent. Rourke stepped aside with Sheriff Boone after the initial paperwork. "She hasn't said a word since I brought her in," Rourke said quietly. "Didn't argue. Didn't flinch." Boone looked through the 2 items on the evidence tray. The card, the notebook. "Military?" he asked. Rourke shrugged. "If she is, she's deep. Real deep." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Something's not right," he said. "Says who?" Rourke asked. Boone looked through the glass at the woman sitting perfectly still in the holding cell, hands folded on the table, staring at nothing. "Says every instinct I've got." There was a long silence. Then Rourke added, without humor, "Her silence, it scared us more than if she'd screamed." The holding cell was quiet. No clanging, no raised voices. Just the hum of overhead fluorescents and the slow tick of the wall clock above the observation window. Kiona Ward sat alone, wrists free now, palms resting flat on the steel table. She hadn't moved much in the past hour, but she had seen everything. The station had 3 cameras sewn above the hallway, one mounted in the corner of the interview room, and a wide-angle unit that covered the cell block. Each had a green indicator. She noted their placement, the blind spots between them, the time gaps in motion-triggered rotation. 2 uniformed deputies worked the swing shift. One of them always lingered too long near the back entrance. The other had a pattern coffee at the top of every hour, restroom 5 minutes after. She hadn't said a word since booking. Sheriff Silas Boone stood on the other side of the glass, arms folded. He'd been watching her since she came in. 58 years old, 3 tours with the Marines before the badge. He wasn't impressed by silence, but this was different. She wasn't just quiet. She was present in a way most people weren't. Controlled, measured, like she belonged somewhere else, somewhere no one had clearance to be. "Something's off," he muttered. Deputy Emmett Rourke stood beside him, arms at his sides. "You see her eyes?" Boone nodded once. "Yeah, I've seen that look before." "Where?" Boone didn't blink. "Fallujah. 5. 3rd Recon. After the night runs." Neither man said anything for a moment. Elijah McGraw stepped into the room quietly, holding a small printout in one hand. He'd driven down to the station when he saw the cruiser pull away from the range. He had no authority here, but Boone had served beside his brother and trusted his judgment. "She left this behind," McGraw said, placing a photo on the desk. It showed a faint, tight scar on the underside of her left wrist, clearly visible as she'd lifted her hands at the range. Boone leaned forward, examining it. "You recognize that pattern?" McGraw asked. Boone squinted. "Fast rope training?" McGraw nodded. "Or insertion rig burns. But clean. Tight. That's Ghost Co. 7 style." Boone looked at him. "That unit still exists." "Not officially." Rourke shifted uncomfortably. "You think she's one of them?" "I don't think she's anything casual," McGraw said. "She's got structure in her posture, control in her breathing. That's not muscle memory from basic." Before anyone could speak further, the phone on Boone's desk rang. He picked it up. "Sheriff Boone." A voice on the other end introduced itself as a field agent from the FBI's Domestic Security Division. They'd received a report matching a partial description of a woman tied to an open counterterrorism investigation. They asked him to detain her pending further review. Boone's jaw tightened. "You're saying she's a suspect?" "We're saying she fits a profile. The timing and behavior patterns are consistent with someone embedded deep inside the network." Boone hung up without comment. He looked back through the glass. "She hasn't asked for a lawyer," he said quietly. "She hasn't asked for anything," Rourke added. McGraw crossed his arms. "She doesn't need anything. She's waiting." Boone stared through the one-way glass. The woman hadn't looked up, hadn't moved. But she knew they were watching. And she was watching back. The Calder County Courthouse sat at the top of a modest hill, red brick and white trim faded by wind and salt over the years. Built in 1887, it still bore its original wooden pews, high ceilings, and iron light fixtures. It wasn't meant for national attention. But by the time the arraignment was called, the gallery was packed. Locals filled every bench. A few reporters stood in the back with notepads and cameras hanging idle. Others were denied entry, standing outside with satellite vans humming. Word had spread fast: an unidentified woman arrested at the range with no ID, a rifle that wasn't logged in any registry, and a silence that no deputy could explain. Kiona Ward sat beside a court-appointed public defender who had met her only 10 minutes earlier. She hadn't said a word to him either. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, hands resting loosely in her lap. She wore the orange jumpsuit without comment. Her face held no defiance, no tension, no fear, just presence. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench, as if she were watching something only she could see. The presiding judge, Eleanor Harmon, entered the chamber at exactly 9:00 a.m. A former JAG officer with 22 years of service and an unimpeachable record, she scanned the courtroom quickly, already sensing the strain in the air. She reviewed the docket, noting the charges: possession of an unregistered firearm, failure to identify to law enforcement, and potential threat to national security. It wasn't the most unusual list she'd seen, but something about the sealed notes in the accompanying file made her pause. The prosecutor rose first, stating that the defendant had refused to give a name or explanation, carried military-grade equipment without documentation, and had exhibited behavior consistent with intelligence field training. He recommended immediate federal custody under the Patriot Act. Before the judge could respond, a man in a dark Homeland Security suit stood from the gallery. Your Honor, Special Agent Talbot. Homeland requests primary jurisdiction in this case. We have reason to believe the defendant may be operating under a false identity and poses a significant counterintelligence risk. Before Harmon could respond again, a second voice cut in. Your Honor, Agent Markham, FBI Joint Task Force. With all due respect, the Bureau has an open file potentially connected to this individual. We have jurisdiction under domestic threat protocols. Judge Harmon raised her hand. The agent stopped mid-step. This is still a state courtroom, she said firmly. Until I see evidence requiring federal transfer, we proceed under county authority. She turned to the defense table. Does the defendant wish to speak? The public defender hesitated. Your Honor, my client has remained unresponsive. I've advised her to cooperate, but she has declined to provide any statement. Judge Harmon looked directly at Kiona. Miss, do you understand the charges being brought against you? Kiona gave the faintest nod. It was neither reluctant nor deferent, just factual. And do you have anything to say at this time? Silence. The room grew still. No coughs, no shifting, just the echo of breathing. A woman in the gallery whispered, She's not afraid. She's waiting. Another voice answered, For what? The first voice replied, barely audible, Not what who. Sheriff Boone stood near the rear wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on the defendant. He said nothing. Neither did Rourke, seated 2 rows behind the defense table, jaw tight, staring. McGraw remained outside, standing near the courthouse steps, arms folded, unwilling to crowd the room but needing to be close. He hadn't seen her flinch Onsano at the range, not during booking, and not now. It wasn't arrogance. It was control. The kind you didn't learn from textbooks. The kind that came from surviving situations where failure meant death. Back inside, Judge Harmon reviewed the file once more. Her brow furrowed. She touched the edge of a sealed folder marked, Dodd Eyes Only. She didn't open it, not yet, but her hand stayed there. She looked up again at Kiona. We'll proceed with arraignment, she said, then paused. Unless someone here is prepared to override the court. No one moved. Kiona still hadn't blinked. Harmon tapped the gavel lightly. Charges are entered into record. The defendant will remain in custody until further notice. Kiona remained still, her gaze never wavering. And all across the room, from veterans to deputies to visiting agents, one thought passed silently between them. She wasn't resisting because she wasn't afraid. She was calm because she wasn't alone. The courtroom had settled into a heavy silence. Judge Harmon glanced at the sealed folder again, fingertips resting on the DOD, marking like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. Kiona hadn't moved. The public defender had gone quiet. The 2 federal agents from Homeland and the FBI sat stiffly, hands clasped, eyes forward, their earlier authority dulled by the weight of something they couldn't see but could feel. Even the crowd had grown still curiosity, replaced by something closer to apprehension. And then, at precisely 9:41 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a deliberate, echoing groan. The sound alone made people turn. What entered made them stand. A man of medium build, his face carved with quiet gravity and lines earned through command, stepped inside wearing full navy dress uniform. The ribbons on his chest reflected the ceiling lights. His shoes didn't make a sound as he walked. The insignia on his shoulders marked him not just as high-ranking but as one of the highest. Rear Admiral Elias Nahuel, Regional Commander, Eastern Seaboard Operations. His skin bore the tone of the northern plains, the lines of a man whose people had lived long before any uniform was stitched, but his bearing was all Navy. No announcement, no introduction, just presence. Every veteran in the room, including the bailiff, a Vietnam-era artilleryman, rose to attention instinctively. A few active-duty reservists in plain clothes straightened in their seats. Even those who didn't know who he was understood they were no longer watching a court case. They were witnessing something larger. Chief Nahuel walked down the center aisle, flanked by two aides in formal uniform. He stopped at the bench, removed a sealed packet from his leather brief, and handed it directly to the bailiff without a word. The bailiff delivered it to Judge Harmon with both hands, as if it weighed more than paper should. The judge opened the seal and began to read. The silence grew deeper. Line by line, her expression changed from confusion to surprise to full recognition. Her mouth pressed shut, her eyes lifted slowly to the defendant. And for the first time since the arraignment began, she addressed Kiona directly, not as a defendant, but as something else entirely. She folded the document closed. In light of the information provided by the United States Department of Defense, she said carefully, her voice steady but quieter than before, all charges against this individual are dismissed, effective immediately. This matter is now considered classified under federal security jurisdiction. No further public record will be entered. This courtroom is hereby cleared of all media, civilian observers, and non-essential personnel. A wave of stunned reactions swept the gallery, but no one moved. The Admiral stepped forward and nodded once to the bailiff, who moved quickly to unlock Kiona's cuffs. She stood calmly, hands falling back to her sides. Her posture changed subtly, shoulders set just a degree sharper, chin slightly lifted. Not aggressive, not proud, just ready. She turned to face the judge. "Permission to speak, Your Honor?" Harmon nodded without hesitation. Kiona looked to Nahuel. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption." Nahuel answered in a voice that filled the room without effort. "On the contrary, Commander, the Navy apologizes to you." Gasps spread in a ripple. At the word Commander, a visible shift swept the room. The agents from Homeland and FBI lowered their eyes. Rourke exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for 10 minutes. Boone stiffened, and McGraw, just stepping through the doors in the back, stopped in place. Kiona Ward. "Commander." Chief Nahuel turned toward the bench. "For the record, this individual is Commander Kiona Ward, formerly attached to Ghost Company 7, Special Activities Division. Her last deployment was in direct service to Operation Silent Harbor 1. She is the sole surviving operator from that engagement and has been under deep cover for the past 11 months. Her identity and movements were classified at the highest levels." A murmur rippled, then faded. Judge Harmon slowly stood. "I served with JAG during Kandahar," she said quietly. "I know what Ghost Co. 7 means." Nahuel gave a short nod. "The commander's actions during Silent Harbor, I prevented a multiport attack on the eastern seaboard. Her presence here today was not intended to compromise her identity, but local circumstances made that unavoidable. With your permission, we will be taking her into protective transfer immediately." Harmon didn't hesitate. "You have it." Kiona turned toward the gallery briefly. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But as she walked past the seats, veterans rose again, this time not by reflex, but in deliberate respect. One older man, in a faded VFW hat, lifted a slow, perfect salute. And McGraw, still at the back, whispered under his breath. She never raised her voice. But the whole damn room just listened. As Kiona walked out, flanked by her escorts, no one followed. No one dared. The courtroom didn't feel like a courthouse anymore. It felt like history had walked through, nodded once, and disappeared. Kiona Ward stepped away from the defendant's table with the same quiet composure she had shown from the moment she arrived. Her back was straight, movements unhurried. She didn't raise her chin or seek the eyes of anyone in the room. But as she passed each row of benches, the silence deepened, not from confusion now, or fear but recognition, the kind that came slowly, all at once, and left people unsure whether to sit still or stand. Chief Nahuel remained near the bench, arms behind his back, watching her pace toward him with the calm of someone used to leading in uncertain places. When she stopped beside him, he turned slightly toward the judge, then addressed the room not with ceremony, but clarity. "For the past 11 months," he said evenly, "Commander Ward has operated under full blackout conditions in civilian cover. She lived, moved, and worked inside a system that never saw her. That was the point. The nature of her mission required that she remain undetectable even if that meant being misunderstood, detained, or disregarded. He glanced toward the gallery, and she fulfilled that mission, in full. Judge Harmon gave a small nod, lips pressed, eyes unreadable. She was a veteran herself and understood better than most what it meant to obey orders without explanation, to carry knowledge you could never share. A woman near the back wiped her eyes. The man beside her, a retired Air Force sergeant by the looks of his jacket, stood slowly. No words, just posture. Another man rose near the aisle, then another. Within moments, nearly every veteran in the courtroom was on their feet. Not clapping, not saluting, just standing. As Kayana and Chief Nahuel turned to exit, they passed the last row of seats where Sheriff Silas Boone stood with arms crossed. He didn't say much, but his voice followed her as she passed him. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not needing us to understand, and still doing what was right." Kayana didn't break stride, but something about the set of her shoulders shifted ever so slightly, acknowledgement without spectacle. Outside the courtroom, the morning air had turned sharper. The press had been moved beyond the perimeter, and the sidewalk was cordoned off. The black SUV waited by the curb, engine idling, doors open. One of Nahuel's aides held out a garment bag. Kayana accepted it wordlessly and stepped inside a nearby conference room to change. When she emerged, her uniform was spotless. Navy blues, service ribbons in perfect alignment, her name stitched above the breast. There were fewer medals than some expected, but the ones present were never given lightly. One stood out, the Navy Cross. Above it, a patch that hadn't been seen in official rotation since the early 2000s. Ghost Company 7, faded but intact. Nahuel said nothing. He didn't need to. They approached the SUV together. Reporters shouted questions from behind the barriers, but none of them were answered. Before entering, Kayana paused and turned slightly, not to the cameras, but toward the courthouse steps where McGraw had taken up position once again. Their eyes met only for a second. He gave her a slight nod. She didn't return it. But she didn't need to. As the door shut and the vehicle pulled away, McGraw exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Behind him, Rourke stepped out from the courthouse and joined him, watching the taillights disappear. "Is she really the last one?" Rourke asked. McGraw didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "Of Ghost Co. 7? Yeah. Far as we'll ever know." Rourke shook his head. "She didn't even blink when the charges came down." "She wasn't worried about proving who she was," McGraw said. "She was worried about finishing what she started." And somewhere between the courthouse bricks and the sealed files now buried deep in federal archives, the story of Commander Kayana Ward, what she did, what she carried, and what she chose to never explain, folded back into silence. But for those who saw her that day, and stood without being asked, that silence would always mean something more. A week later, Emmett Rourke stood outside the gates of Naval Station Norfolk with a printed invitation in hand and a security escort waiting. He had never been on a base this size. Not as a guest. Not like this. The invitation had come quietly delivered by a plainclothes officer who simply said, "You're expected. No RSVP. No explanations." He was guided through 2 checkpoints, a background scan, and a silent hallway with frosted glass on both sides. The final door opened to a small auditorium, no more than 50 seats. All were filled with men and women in quiet clothes who stood like they had known command, fieldwork, or both. No one spoke above a murmur. Most carried themselves with the same posture Rourke remembered from that courtroom. On stage stood a single podium and a flag. Nothing more. Rear Admiral Nahuel entered without introduction and stepped up. He didn't adjust the microphone or look for applause. "Today," he said simply, "we recognize Commander Kayana Ward for actions undertaken during Operation Silent Harbor I. Details remain classified. What can be shared is this: her work disrupted a domestic threat network with confirmed international funding and coordination. Her actions prevented simultaneous attacks on 3 major shipping ports. Thousands of lives were spared." He paused, looking around the room. "But that's not why we're here." There was a moment of quiet. "We're here," he continued, "because she waited. She stayed buried in cover for 11 months, refused to break protocol even under arrest, and allowed the system to work flawed as it is. She didn't just save lives by firing. She saved lives by not firing when the world pushed her to act too soon." He stepped back. Kiona walked forward in full uniform. The Navy Cross was pinned to her chest, along with unit citations and commendations that told no story on their own but meant everything to the people in the room. There were no cameras, no applause, just stillness. When the ceremony ended, Rourke stepped forward. She turned to face him. "I want to apologize," he began, but she raised a hand lightly. "No need," she said. "You followed protocol. And because of that, I had the time to finish what needed finishing." They shook hands. Her grip was firm, steady, the same as it had been in silence. Rourke nodded once, unsure what else to say. As he turned to leave, Kiona added, "Not every threat looks like a threat. You saw something, but you didn't jump. That matters." Outside Norfolk, in a quiet FedEx drop point just outside Calder's Bluff, McGraw signed for a long cardboard package with no return address. Inside was a military-grade thermal spotting scope and a folded sheet of paper, unmarked, except for 3 words typed in clean block lettering: "Keep watching." He placed the note on the shelf behind the register, where it stayed, tucked between a ledger and a box of earplugs. He didn't say anything to the regulars. But he moved Lane 12 to a different part of the Schedulino, longer open to general use. Some people read between the lines. Most didn't. That was fine. It was late October when Elijah McGraw first noticed the girl on Lane 12. She couldn't have been more than 22. Slim frame, dark hoodie, plain jeans. Her rifle was clean, well-maintained, civilian legal, but not beginner's gear. She unpacked it without talking to anyone, set up alone, and went to work. McGraw didn't watch her right away. He'd learned not to jump at every quiet shooter who came through. But something in the way she moved caught his eye. Her footing was precise, breathing controlled, transitions smooth. She adjusted for wind, not with instruments but with instinct. Her eyes scanned the tree line, read the movement in the leaves, the way light cut across the gravel. She wrote in a small notebook after every round. No bragging, no selfies, no range chatter, just mark, fire, record. At 300 yards, she switched position without calling for help or needing confirmation. At 500, she hit metal and reset like it meant nothing. McGraw leaned forward in the booth, crossed his arms, and watched for another 10 minutes. Then he went into the back room, pulled open the locked drawer beneath the counter, and removed a single business card he hadn't touched in over 6 months. He dialed the number. A neutral voice answered. "Blue Water," McGraw said. "Still Horizon," the voice replied. "I've got one," McGraw said. "Young. Too smooth for the story she gave. Same pattern. We'll look into it." They hung up. A week later, a man arrived at the range. Mid-40s, close-cut hair, polite, but unreadable. He didn't ask for a lane. He walked directly to McGraw's booth. "Mr. McGraw," he said, "we appreciate the call. She was a test. You passed." McGraw didn't smile. "She's good." "She is. Not trained yet, but something in her caught the commander's attention." He placed a small envelope on the counter. Inside was a new business, card matte black, embossed with the Ghostco 7 insignia, and a different number. "We don't recruit often," the man said, "but when we do, it's because people like you help us see the ones who don't want to be seen." As he turned to leave, he added, "Some of us are always around. You just have to know how to look." The man walked away. The girl packed her gear and followed him without a word. McGraw stayed at the booth until closing. Before locking up, he placed the new card next to the old one. Then he took the thermal scope from the shelf and moved it to the window. Lane 12 would stay open. But not for everyone. Just for the ones who moved a certain way. In life, There are people who carry enormous responsibility without ever seeking recognition. They don't wear their service on their sleeve, and they don't ask to be seen. Commander Kiona Ward's story reminds us that true honor isn't about being noticed, it's about standing by what's right, even when no one's watching. Sometimes, doing the right thing means waiting. It means staying silent when speaking might cost more than it helps. For those who have served, who've sacrificed quietly, or who've been misunderstood, your worth has never been measured by headlines. It lives in your restraint, your discipline, and your quiet courage. And for the rest of us, the lesson is simple. Learn to pay attention. Not everything that matters announces itself. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched something in you, consider subscribing to hear more untold accounts of quiet service and extraordinary strength. Until next time, stay well, stay watchful, and remember, sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never needed to be seen.